Hi, I'm Charlie Munford, and this is Agential Topics. Agential Topics is a meeting put on in part by the Agential Biology Institute. And the Agential Biology Institute is founded because we believe that there's a missing causal layer in biology that gives cells the intentional direction as they develop. And we're building the infrastructure to study that missing causal layer. Agential Topics is a meeting where we get together and try to surface the very best ideas we can find about cognition and agency and compare them to one another and try to find testable consequences of them that we can investigate empirically. So today our guest is Matt Segall. He's a philosopher, and without too much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Charlie. Can everyone hear me all right? Is that loud enough if I talk at this level? Cool. I'm on the road, so I don't have my usual podcast set up with my microphone and everything, but really good to join you all. It's about 10 p.m. here in Chiang Mai, Thailand. So if I get sloppy in the second hour or so, that's why. I Yeah, I'm a process philosopher, and I'm going to offer some pretty speculative ideas here. I think along the lines of Alfred North Whitehead, who hopefully some of you are a little bit familiar with. I know Rupert is. I know Wayne is. And also, you might detect some of the ideas of Charles Saunders Peirce in the background of what I'll share. And just as a way into this, because I am going to be talking not only about biology and in particular Stu Kaufman's idea of the adjacent possible, but also about theology. And Peirce and Whitehead have a very unique way of getting into that subject matter. And I think when we're talking about agency, it's we can frame it in terms of just scientific inquiry, where we're trying to observe and model biological systems. But if we consider Peirce's methodology, there's basically three domains that we need to uh, weave together when we're doing this larger speculative project that I'm gonna to touch on today, where we've got our common sense everyday experience of being agents, where we have a whole society where we assume that we have some degree of freedom to make decisions about how we behave and what we believe. Right. So there's that whole common sense domain that we more or less take for granted, including scientists who are doing research on organisms and um, the physical world. Whitehead has this great line that scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study. And so, from a Whiteheadian point of view, and from Peirce's point of view as well, um, science shouldn't imagine that it's in the business of explaining away our common sense presuppositions. And then the role of speculative philosophy then is to kind of adjudicate between common sense, the common sense understanding of agency, say, and then what inquiry, what observation and experiment and modeling tell us about the nature of nature. There's no question that science sometimes will upset and disturb common sense, but at the end of the day, science itself depends on common sense as well. And so um, the speculative ideas I'm going to offer today are an attempt to kind of mediate here. Um, Charlie sent around a longer essay that I wrote in preparation for this, and
Matt
hopefully,
Segall. He's awesome, by the way.
what?
Matt Se-
Sorry, I got muted there. Um,
That was my fault. I'm so sorry.
it's okay, you had to mute everyone. Um, yeah, if you didn't get a chance to read the longer essay that Charlie sent around, hopefully I'll be able to summarize it adequately enough that you'll get the main thrust of it. So, what I'll share is basically a sketch of an evolutionary metaphysics. And one way of summarizing this whole project is I'm trying to escape what you could call a semantic gravity well, where we ask a question that I think is poorly posed. It's the wrong problem. We ask, is does form arise out of flow? Or we could say, does flow create form? Or does flow discover form? It's already there. When a convection cell emerges, is that constraint in some sense, as Mike Levin might say, being ingressed from another domain? Or is it just emerging from the bottom up, but we don't need to make reference to any realm of forms to explain it, right? I think construing it as an either or question, either flow creates form or flow discovers form, is is a poorly formed question. I think we need to see how flow and form uh, depend on one another. The sense of either comes through contrast with the other. Um, Flux or form and flow are like just like creation and discovery in mathematics. These are like wave and trough. You can't really make sense of either without the other. So um, I see Catherine is here. I'm not sure if Stu is listening as well, but I think of Stu as one of the most prophetic instigators of this agential turn. I mean, there's a whole chorus. Many of you are also here, who are here, are participating in this turn. And what I want to argue is that this agential turn in biology can't actually be quarantined within biology. If organisms have genuine agency, and if the biosphere is genuinely creating its own future in an unprestatable way, then the categories that we've inherited for thinking nature have to be totally renovated and renovated in two directions at once. Downward into physics, so that the supposedly universal and context independent laws and constants of mechanics come to look like actually special abstractions from a wider historical flux of cosmogenesis. And also in the other direction, upward into theology, so that, what has traditionally been called God, and you can replace that word with whatever you want. It's sort of a placeholder that I would give to how we answer this question of the origin of intelligibility. Um, Anyone who cares about truth in a non-relativistic sense, um, anyone who cares about goodness in a moral sense, or beauty, I think is presupposing in one way or another some kind of what I would call theology, some kind of basis for intelligibility, right? And so I'm going to be using the God word in the sense that Whitehead means it. It's a metaphysical concept of God. It doesn't necessarily stem from any commitment to a particular religion. So take it in the metaphysical sense. And so we need to go downward and renovate our ideas of physics to historicize physics, as I'll show, but also upward into theology so that we don't have this idea of God as an impassive engineer who's just stamping the gears on a finished clockwork universe, and become something more like what I'll describe as an eternally evolving embryo. Right. And so in my maybe mad mind, these two movements are one movement. Heraclitus has this great line, the way up and the way down are the same way. And so to historicize physics is to deny that there's any prestatable state space from which the future of the universe could be deduced. And to deny a final blueprint is also to transform what we might mean by a word like God. Because now, if there's no deducible future, that's not only true for us and for our knowledge, it's true also for God. In this theology that I'll lay out, this evolutionary theology, even God can't know the future. So I'll start with Stu Kaufman's favorite example of exaptation. Uh, Stu's argued um, that evolving organisms are not they're not browsing a menu of morphologies. Life creates its own adjacent possibilities, and then it wanders into some subset of them, which opens up the next subset in turn. And so the possible functions of an organ or a protein can't be specified in advance of organismic becoming. And so in this rendering of the adjacent possible, a function can't be conceived of as an isolable property of a part, right? Like a selfish gene or something. Another of Stu's favorite example is the beating heart. Um, has countless causal consequences, but only a subset of them keep us alive. So a function can only be defined in relation to the organism for whom it matters and the environment that it inhabits. And the organism, in Kant's sense, is a whole whose parts produce one another for the sake of the whole. And Stu's argument that you can't prestate the configuration space of the biosphere is, to borrow a metaphor from Whitehead, it's to throw a match into the powder keg of the mechanistic neo-Darwinian workshop. It just blows up the whole thing. And I've been really excited to get a look at Stu's new book in draft form. And he makes clear there that, life's not merely adapting to a pre-given environment. Organisms jury rig, as he puts it, mutual ways of making a living together. So species are offering affordances to one another, and in receiving those affordances, they're discovering new ways of becoming together. And so the biosphere becomes a fabric of enablements instead of a mechanism of entailments, to use some of his terminology. Now, classical physicalism knows only two kinds of futures. There's the deducible future of Newtonian mechanics, and then the calculable frequencies of statistical mechanics. Both of these presuppose that the space of possibilities is already laid out, and that natural history is a complicated trajectory through a list of options that, again, are fixed in advance. Now, Stu's claim is that the adjacent possible is not a region of extended space that hasn't been charted yet. It's the result of what we might call spatiation, right? It's the result of relevant biological possibilities that are brought into being by the very creatures that prehend them or that feel them, to use Whitehead's term. So if that's right, then this modern dream or nightmare of science that it could gain total prediction, predictive power, and control over nature, that's not just a hard problem, but it becomes impossible in principle. So the motive for true science, then, if Stu's paradigm here is right, um, is not mastery anymore, whether instrumental mastery or representational mastery in terms of like a complete description or something. The motive for science becomes participation, which I would describe as a collaboration with a democracy of fellow creatures, one of Whitehead's phrases, that we can learn to commune with, but we can't command. So I think agential biology, as I understand it, is what it looks like when the life sciences take their own creaturely participation seriously as a condition not only for knowing, but also for our being, for our continued survival, and maybe even our ability to thrive on this planet. So let me now bring in some of Whitehead's ideas to provide what I think is a metaphysics that helps give Stu Kaufman's intuitions here, which are very well, spelled out mathematically and conceptually. But I think Whitehead provides a categorical basis, a metaphysical structure here that allows us to think about um, what the ultimate categories at play here are. So in Process and Reality, although he's a process philosopher for whom everything is related to everything else and in constant creative advance, he also has this category of eternal objects. A lot of people come to Whitehead's work expecting it to be all process all the time, and then they stub their toe on eternal objects and they get upset. And some people have tried to um, remodel Whitehead's scheme to get rid of eternal objects, and not quite sure that can work. It's almost like trying to break a magnet in half. You end up with just a smaller magnet with two poles. Eternal objects exist in polar opposition to actual occasions, the other main category in Whitehead's scheme. And I'll try to unpack the role that they play. But he distinguishes these eternal objects, which he also calls pure potentials or forms of definiteness, um, from actuality. And so he's not an actualist, right? He does have this realm of potentials or possibilities, you could say, that's not reducible to the physical world, but he's not a dualist. So these eternal objects he describes as having they're an infinite multiplicity. He didn't yet have the tools to do this, but he's trying to think beyond set theory here. So he's not talking about an infinite set. We can get into that detail later. It's an infinite multiplicity. And he distinguishes those from what he calls propositions. And so there's a lot of technical machinery here, but basically for Whitehead, a proposition is what he calls an impure potential. So eternal objects are pure potentials. Propositions are impure potentials in the sense that they're hybrids of actuality and possibility. Or as he puts it, their propositions are matters of fact in potential determination. So it's his theory of theories. It's his theory of propositions are like proposals. Um, but we don't imagine you know what he means by proposition because you've studied some logic. His concept of a proposition is far stranger and wider and wilder than the logicians. In Whitehead's universe, for example, even oysters entertain propositions, right? And so it's almost like these are semiotic acts, acts of interpretation in Peirce's sense. Whitehead's version of that is his concept of propositions. And so a proposition is not primarily something that we need to worry about being true or false. There are true and false propositions in Whitehead's scheme, but really they function as lures for feeling in his terms. He says in Process and Reality, a proposition may be more important for being interesting than for being true. So organisms, all organisms, down to single cells, feel propositions in Whitehead's view, and they're sensing in these propositions not only what is, which would be a conformal proposition, but also a proposition can grant an organism a feeling of a relevant alternative, which would strictly speaking be a false proposition, a non-conformal proposition. And for Whitehead, novel propositions enter experience and can alter behavior and therefore reshape reality. So novelty flows into Whitehead's cosmos through these non-conforming or false propositions. Um, and so here's the crucial point here. Hopefully, my brief attempt to introduce these categories leaves you with some taste for what they mean. Um, Whitehead holds that in the becoming of the world and the evolution of the biosphere and of the whole cosmos, novel propositions can be continually created. But he says there are no new eternal objects. There are no new possibilities in Whitehead's scheme. And so on the face of it, it sounds like he's going to be in disagreement there with Stu, or Stu would be in disagreement with Whitehead. No new eternal objects, but there are new propositions, right? So um, now what I would like to propose is that when Stu's talking about unprestatable possibilities, um, they're not actually eternal objects in Whitehead's sense. I think they're more like Whitehead's propositions. So what does this shift buy for us if we move from saying that it's new possibilities that are being created in these adjacent spaces, or that it's new propositions in Whitehead's sense? Well, metaphysically, I think we don't need, when we explain an exaptation, we don't require that a new form, a new possibility is conjured out of nothing. If it's a new proposition, what we're getting is a novel situation, a novel actual occasion in which a definite form takes on a novel relevance and so functions as a fresh lure in Whitehead's sense. So um, Whitehead has this phrase that's almost, I would say, an exact translation of biological exaptation. He says that with a new proposition, I quote, a novelty has emerged into creation. The novelty may promote or destroy order. It may be good or bad, but it is a new form, or at least an old form in a new function, right? An old form in a new function. So that's exaptation in Whiteheadese, I would suggest. And I think it lets us affirm everything that Stu wants. It allows us to affirm the undeducibility of the adjacent possible, but we don't have to pay what I think is a pretty steep metaphysical bill of creating possibility from nothing. So the relevant function is genuinely new, even if the possibility as such is not. Um, so that's a proposal about Whitehead's concept of propositions that I'm going to make, and I'll be curious to hear what folks here think of that. There's another distinction I want to consider here, which is the difference between extensive and intensive. Um, when when a mechanism requires some kind of pre-stated phase space, it's treating possibility extensively as a manifold of alternatives that are fixed in advance, as a kind of metrical space, so that becoming is just a trajectory through points that were already there. And that's the picture that I think Stu is demolishing. But the realm of eternal objects in Whitehead's scheme is not such a space. It's not a metrical space. It's not an extensive space. The eternal objects aren't points on a grid. They carry no antecedent metrical determination. Their relevance is graded intensively by the attractiveness of a possibility to a particular becoming occasion, to a particular organism, let's say. And the realization of that relevance is accomplished only in and by each becoming creature. And further, the realm of eternal objects is itself enriched, Whitehead would say, occasion by occasion, by the very actualizations that that realm solicits. And so, if you're familiar with Mike Levin's proposal of a Platonic morphospace, you might have noticed I'm in drawing on Whitehead saying that the agency is with the organisms, not with the eternal objects or the forms. The forms lure, they solicit, but the decision, the agency is with the organism in this view. So we could say that the adjacent possible is genuinely created at the extensive level, but that there was no point um, there's no point on any map or in any phase space that would let us read off in advance that, oh, this lineage will exact uh, along into a swim bladder, right? But at the intensive level, possibilities come with a graduated or in a sense ordered eligibility, right? So some next steps are erotically eligible to be selected, they're alluring, and others are negligible. And that grading deepens as history unfolds, right? And so an intensive ordering of possibility is different than an extensive ordering in this sense. And part of why I want to make this distinction is to head off an objection that some may make, that our inability to predict which exaptation might occur in the future is just a fact about the limits of our own knowledge, not a fact about the absence of entailment in evolution. Um, for example, a double pendulum, it's unpredictable, but its behavior remains wholly deterministic in principle. Um, Whitehead has a very interesting section in Process and Reality where he distinguishes between statistical and non-statistical grounds of probability or judgments of probability. He says a statistical judgment is always presupposing a settled ground or a defined population of comparable instances over which frequencies can be taken. And that ground is itself an achievement of a stable order, a stable social order, he would say. Societies for him are just enduring um, groups of occasions that recur and repeat the same patterns through time, so as to endure through time. And so the grounds of a statistical analysis of probability are these stable social orders. They're cosmic epochs, as he called them, whose habits supply the reference class. But he says there are situations in which we can't establish such a ground or no such ground exists because the space of alternatives is not yet constituted. And here, he says, our judgment can and must proceed non-statistically by way of the felt relevance, intensive relevance of unrealized possibility to the case at hand. And this isn't a matter of counting instances in a pre-given sample for Whitehead. And I would say that evolutionary creativity and acceptation and agency in the biological world is an example of these non-statistical forms of judgment in this Whiteheadian sense. So the unprestatable, it's not a not yet, it's not the not yet counted, it's the not yet constituted as countable, right? So the double pendulum's outcome space is fixed and pre-given. So a probability measure is in principle definable, and its unpredictability is merely epistemic, but an acceptation's unpredictability is generative. So there's no antecedent measure because the relevant outcome space comes into being with the innovation, right? So this is all just an attempt to make clear this isn't a conflation of the epistemic with the ontic. One could still make that argument, but hopefully this makes clear that um, I'm trying to avoid that. This isn't a matter of a gap in our knowledge. It's the positive um, trace of a process that's generating its own next possibilities. And this idea of a non-statistical um, judgment of probability in Whitehead based on a feeling of intensive relevance of the gradation of eternal objects to a given situation. It's his attempt to solve what's called the frame problem in cognitive science, and it's a very difficult problem. And a critic would be really concerned that he's reaching for something that ends up being theological to solve that problem. But it could be that the frame problem itself is downstream of a different theological assumption that's been submerged, that follows from the whole mechanistic paradigm that definitely does originate in a particular with a particular theological imaginative background. Um, so we could get into that too. But so one of the points here is that this intensive form of organization of possibilities, it's a different form of intelligibility that's not a statistical form. It can't be statistically measured. And so the indefiniteness of uh, the adjacent possible or the possibility space, as Stu would refer to it, and he wants to say that it's indefinite um, before an acceptation occurs or before an ingression occurs. We can grant that it's not extensively ordered, but I think we can say with Whitehead that it is intensively ordered. So it's not just a formless chaos. It comes intensively ordered by its relevance for each novel occasion before it gets extensively structured into probabilities after the fact. And now, Whitehead's view is that it's God that orders the relevance of the eternal objects, intensive relevance of the eternal objects. And he says, apart from God, there could be no relevant novelty. So the primordial nature of God, as he calls it, is the valuation of unrealized possibility, again, granting intensive relevance that for each occasion in its unique situation makes some next steps erotically eligible and others negligible, right? So scientific quantification of the extensive measurement of that probability space, it stabilizes the intensive and it remains valid within a settled epoch. But it's this at the extensive measures they're silent at the creative edges where new possibilities are constituted. So there's a deeper intensive eligibility at play here than the statistical methods presuppose. Then that statistical methods presuppose but can't calculate. So that's a lot. Um, those who are familiar with Bayesian statistics, I know some of you here are definitely are. Um, the temptation upon first understanding Whitehead's account of the primordial nature of God here as the valuer or the orderer of the eternal objects, you might be tempted to say that um, God's the prime prior in some sense, right? But again, God's ordering of the eternal objects is an intensive ordering, not an extensive one, so that the realm of eternal objects or possibilities, it's not a metrical phase space amenable to statistical analysis. Okay, so I've been reading some of the work of Montevel and Masio on organization and variation in biology, and they've given this idea of the Kantian whole a really rigorous scientific articulation. They distinguish in their papers from about 10 years ago at this point, generic objects, the theoretical objects of physics, like, every electron can be treated as identical, its history can be bracketed. They distinguish those generic objects of physics from the specific objects of biology, organisms, which are historically individuated and whose phase spaces are unprestatable. Each organism differs from one another, and even the constraints that establish an organism as an organism shift across development, right? So there's closure, but there's variation within that closure. That means that you need a new description of the constraints for an organism across its own lifespan. And so an organism is able to persist not like a rock, in that, a rock resists change just by trying to uh, maintain its form, but an organism seems more like a melody. I see Richard Watson is here. He might like this metaphor that an organism is more like a melody that survives by resonating with its environment, both being modified by and modifying that environment, metamorphosing from one regime of what Monteval and Masio call closure of constraints to another. And so they want to historicize biology then, um, to protect it from reduction to physics. But the Whiteheadian step that I'm wanting to make here is to go further and say that we should learn from biology how to historicize physics, so that even the objects of physics should be conceived as they are conceiving of organisms. And this is basically Whitehead's move, right? He says physics is the study of the smaller organisms, and biology the study of the larger, or you could say the mid-size. Astrophysics studies the really big organisms. Now, none of that would mean, historicizing physics, organicizing physics, if you want. It doesn't mean abandoning mathematical idealization. I think the power of the models of physics speaks for itself. It's just that we shouldn't mistake those models um, for concrete realities, as if the laws of physics were somehow ahistorical. Um, we don't want to mistake a successful method for a finished ontology. And so, from the perspective of uh, an evolutionary cosmology, the law-like regularities of physics are better understood as widespread habits. They're stable roots of inheritance. They're um, enduring societies, in Whitehead's terms, of process that are so deeply canalized that they appear eternal to us. Uh, each electron looks interchangeable with every other, not because it stands outside of history, but because what Whitehead calls the electromagnetic society is among the most generic and stable habits of our cosmic epoch. It's an achievement of cosmic evolution rather than some kind of law imposed from beyond it, or even a design. And I think the mechanistic approach to physics just hands intelligent design theorists uh, everything they would want, um, to support their idea of an external creator deity. So I think a convection cell, whether it's in a boiling pot or a hurricane or a star, is already exhibiting a kind of circular causality, a kind of self-maintenance, constraints that are partly enmeshed with their own processes. They're dissipative structures, right? And I would read these as like the first stammering rehearsal of what Montevill and Masio call closure. Um, Agency, therefore, it doesn't switch on and off, but it shades off as you go down the scale of complexity. It shades up as you go up. Um, all right, so that's the way down, historicizing physics. Now, what about the way up? If there's no pre-stated state space, there's no blueprint, there's no theory of everything, then we have to rethink theology as much as we have to rethink physics. Reductive physicalism turns local idealizations of closed systems into an absolute reduction base. Intelligent design patches the gaps in that mechanistic account by appeal to a transcendent demiurge or designer god. And I think both mistake the mechanistic abstraction for the concrete reality here. And so the proposal I'm offering is to take the biologist's insight into these principles of variation and organization. And variation assures that organization is always relative and never complete. There's never total closure, even in the biological world, and cosmologize these insights. So cosmogenesis then can be understood as closure writ large, right? But emphatically not a closure that's ever finally achieved. It's always a relative closure. If closure was finally achieved, organisms would be immortal, right? And we know that death is a very important part of the evolutionary process. Nonetheless, there is the approach uh, to closure that's evident in nature and especially in the living world. So in Whitehead's cosmology, we could call it an evolutionary panentheism. So not theism, not pantheism, but panentheism. He wants to hold uh, three ultimate categories distinct. There's creativity on the one hand, there's God, and then there's the world. Creativity is his principle of unrest. It's what ensures that no form is final, that no closure can ever be complete. It's what prevents even God from knowing the future in its full concreteness. And Whitehead's God is described as dipolar. There's a primordial nature, which is this erotic intensity that's grading relevant possibility. And again, this is not a set of a finite set of forms in a Platonic freezer or something. It's rather the primordial nature is described by Whitehead as blind appetition that adds an incline to the multiplicity of possibilities, providing an axiological definiteness without spatiotemporal or any metrical determination. The consequent nature of God then is not the blind eros, but to use the other Greek term for love, the agapic tenderness that receives um, everything that happens in the world and recollects every finite occasion of experience into this ever diversifying harmony. So it's like a raucous jazz ensemble, not a museum archive, right? So you've got these two poles of the divine, eros in the primordial pole and agape in the consequent pole. And so this gives a certain structure to the God world relation. We're no longer dealing with a God who is external to the universe, designing it from the outside. It's not anymore the image of a potter shaping clay or an engineer designing an artifact, though of course, if you really talk to a potter or an engineer, you'll know that they're as made by what they're making as the reverse, right? And so real craftsmen and craftswomen, I think, tell the lie to this caricature that a potter is just has the design in mind and then goes to work on the clay. No, the clay resists the design, and the artist always has to be responsive to that resistance. So the point here, though, is that the God-world relation here is internal, it's mutually constitutive, and I think the better image here is one of gestation. It's not creatio ex nihilo. It's not the universe, it's not the unilateral fabrication by some kind of deistic dictator. Um, it's more like a process of embryogenesis, and embryogenesis with no pre-given adult form um, that it either proceeds from or is obliged to reach as an end. And this really confounds classical theology. It's no longer God as a parent and humans and all creatures as dependent children. And this is a view that is often called process theology, and Stu has hinted towards this in some recent interviews. Um, so let me move ahead here and wrap up. In his Noema interview about his new book, and a bit in the book too, Stu talks about Plato and his dialogue Timaeus. It's this likely story, and what I've just offered in terms of these two poles of the divine and the God world relationship. It's another likely story in the spirit of Plato's Timaeus, and I think what I've been sharing here in terms of the theological implications as well as the cosmological implications of agential biology. I think Stu in his more recent work is already on the threshold of this type of vision, where again we want to keep scientific inquiry distinct from common sense and speculative metaphysics, but distinction doesn't mean we can dissociate these things. And so I'm trying to offer, a big picture view here, not just make a simple proposal as I did earlier about um, not interpreting what Stu is suggesting as new possibilities, but rather, in Whitehead's terms, new propositions emerging as the biosphere evolves. But I'm also like Stu wants to. I'm talking about a larger civilization forming and sustaining vision here, right? And so Stu talks about this third transition beyond classical and quantum paradigms, both of which still presuppose a pre-stated phase space, into what he calls a domain of no entailing law. And in that Noema interview, he talks about the first few words of Genesis, where you can read the the first few words in two tenses, either God created in the past tense, or a deist engineer who finished the world in 7 days or six and then withdraws. Or you could read it as present tense. God creates and is creating. And this is an immanent God that's becoming with the world. Um, and I cheer all of that. I think that's the right direction to go in. But I want to offer a nuance here. There's a genealogy that Stu offers in which Eros is championed as unpredictable creativity, and Logos is reduced to a kind of deductive logic. And Stu blames Plato for absorbing the first, Eros, into the second, um, so that Logos dominates in this deductive engineer type of Logos. And so Plato becomes the ancestor of mechanism, the mechanical philosophy in this story. And Stu wants to rescue Eros from Logos. And so what I would want to propose in closing here is something a little bit subtler. Um, and this is already a tension that I think is at work in Stu's in that interview and in his book. I want to recover Logos alongside Eros, and an Eros that Logos can't finally do without, because I think Logos, if you really look at the tradition of Western philosophizing from Heraclitus through Philo of Alexandria to Maximus the Confessor, right? A Greek, a Jew, a Christian. Logos was never the cold engineer um, that's designing from a distance. Logos is always described as living, as fluid, as relational, even carnal in the Christian tradition, incarnate. And interestingly, I've heard and verified this, the Chinese Bible renders logos with the word Tao. Um, in chapter 13, Stu mentions Tao as an alternative to logos, but there could be a translation here. And so the logos I would like to resuscitate, it's not a frozen blueprint, right? I would call it the erotic axiology of possibility itself. It's the grading of relevance by which the indefinite becomes not a set of predetermined variables, but a relevant nexus of viable next steps, right? This is the intensive ordering I was mentioning earlier. And so logos understood in this way, it's not the enemy of the adjacent possible, it's the condition of possibility, of its possibility. So eros without logos would be blind yearning. Logos without eros would be dead deduction. And the kind of living logos I'm suggesting here is it always requires the marriage of these two. And I would read Plato differently. I'd read him dramatically. He wrote dialogues, not doctrines, right? And I think he might actually be closer to our side here than Stu's genealogy is suggesting. The Timaeus, it does contain this image of the demiurge looking to the eternal forms as the model, and creating the cosmos as a copy of that model. But as you know, many commentators on the Timaeus have shown, including John Sallis in his book Chorology, that account is interrupted. Timaeus is the astronomer who, in the dialogue, is asked to give this account of the origin of the world. His first attempt with the demiurge, looking at the forms to make the world as a copy, reaches an aporia. It fails. It's interrupted, and so he has to start over. And the reason he has to start over is because he runs into what Plato calls the chora, or the receptacle, which is described as this wandering wet nurse of becoming. It's the form of formlessness, you might say. It always appears, but never as itself, right? There's nothing that isn't an example of it. In Whitehead's philosophy, the chora becomes creativity. Um, in Plato, the chora becomes the that which resists the drive to uh, total explanation. It's what the demiurge can't quite figure out, right? And it's what allows this dialogue, when read dramatically, to literally perform the impossibility of preformation, of this idea of the cosmos being deduced through some kind of law. So the demiurge is the image of temptation to hubris, and I think the chora interrupts that temptation, and it's offering us a humbling cure for that hubris. So that's the proposal. There's the theological piece. Um, there's the historicization of physics, and then the piece where I'm suggesting that we don't need to create new possibilities to understand the non-prestatability of biospheric evolution. It's more that new propositions in Whitehead sense are being created. That's a rather technical point, but that's what I wanted to share with you all tonight. So thanks for your attention and welcome comments, questions, challenges, or changes of subject if you'd prefer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. That was wonderful. That was really deep, and there's so much to respond to. Of course, I'm sure um, all of us have lots of thoughts as you went through that proposal. So we're going to go into the discussion part. Just as a reminder to everyone, at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says React. And if you press that, you'll see that there's a way to raise your hand. And the way you ask a question in this format is just press that raise hand button, and that puts you in a queue. And I try to go through people expeditiously if possible. If you have follow-up questions after your questions, just try to keep them short so we can keep moving. Um, but yeah, I just before we do that, quickly, I just wanted to kind of summarize what I heard you say, Matt. Just kind of refocus everyone just for a moment. Because, this meeting is about what process gives rise to biological intentions. And so the question I heard you asking is a adjacent question, um, or the one you started with, are biological intentions predictable in a sense, pre-statable? And you're responding to Stu Kaufman's idea of the adjacent possible, which basically says no, and so you're bringing this Whitehead process philosophy to bear on it. Um, in Whitehead, intentions arise through these lures of propositions, which are a combination of pure possibility, which is this infinite set of forms, and fact. So form and form and flow, as you said, are wave and trough. So they arise together. And that gives us this metaphysics of God or everything as a developing whole, something that's not sort of outside the universe controlling it, but is embedded and part of the universe. And you called it historicizing physics, so that physics itself is developing, which is a concept we've definitely heard before. In fact, Rupert, as I recall, has even empirically investigated this question of whether the constants of physics have migrated over time, which is totally fascinating. So yeah, that brings us back to the question. It's slightly different. I'm still the way I'm hearing it is I'm trying to map it onto the question of where does the craving for function come from? Because we're talking about exaptations. Embedded in that idea is already the idea of a novel function. And so where the craving for function comes from that combination of fact and possibility is where I am right now. So with that, I'll just turn it over because I've already said enough, and I'll turn it over. I think the first is Richard.
Hi there. Uh, Matt, thank you. I find so much so easy to agree with in all of that. It really resonates with me really strongly. Um, Also, Charlie, how do you do what you just did, where you just summarize so many interesting things about what you just said and hold them all in one place at one time? I totally can't do that. My question is much more squidgy than that. Matt, I had a couple of small bits that I missed that I wanted you to repeat very briefly. You said that there were three things in this view: creativity, something, and world. Can you tell me the something?
Just God was the second.
Ah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
Whitehead distinguished the point there is usually most theisms identify the the creativity with God. God is the creator. Whitehead's God is not a creator, right? That's a
yeah.
distinct, his ultimate category is creativity,
Yeah.
which is that even
So
God
God
is
is the
subject.
relationship between the impetus and the structure.
That's
Yeah.
right. God the relator instead of
Cool.
God the creator. Yeah.
Yeah. And this notion of historicizing physics, uh, there was something that I wanted to chip in there, which is something like, yeah, that makes sense to me that we want to be able to talk about the the history of electrons that makes them not all the same because they all have different histories. And we want to talk about the history of the cosmos that makes it not unique because there are other histories it could have had. But when they are very far away from our sense of scale, they don't look very agential, right? When they're very far away from our sense of scale, when our physical scale, our temporal scale, they look all the same, like electrons, or they look like it's just one thing, like the cosmos. It only happened once, sort of thing. And that gives us a way to um, historicize, which is not different from agencyify everything, but they have agency that's relevant to our scale, relevant to our temporal scale and our physical scale, or agency that isn't so relevant to our temporal scale and physical scale. So we can sort of have our cake and eat it by keeping these things on the same spectrum, but keeping them far away from us, which is consistent with our everyday interaction with them. So I wondered how that lands with you. And my last bit, if I may, is I wonder if Whitehead has any sense of recursion here. So that there might be shells or layers of things that look permanent and things that look changing. And to one within one layer, it looks like, well, these are the processes and these are the eternal truths. But to the next layer up, those things look interchangeable, and then there's a process that transfers one to another. Uh, and yet the process that transfers one to the other is also law-like. And it's like, ah, shit, now I have to move up another level. And so we have this kind of recursiveness to it. Is there any notion of that?
Yeah. Well, what you're recounting of what's involved in historicization, I totally agree with. I think Whitehead has something like what you're describing. Um, he would describe the history of the universe as sort of laying down a series of um, nested, uh, you could say regimes of order. He calls them societies. Uh, Initially, there's what he calls the geometric society, which establishes just like rules of congruency, and then within that, the electromagnetic society, um, and then gradually these environmental sort of uh, societies shelter more and more um, complex forms of organization within them. And so, from our perspective, it looks like electromagnetism is pretty much, the laws are uh, set, and um, and yet, if you uh, rewind cosmic history, there was a point where decisions were made, by electrons to behave in a certain way. They could have made other decisions. And once that decision was made, though, it got locked into place. And so looking back from our perspective, it seems like a law, but 13 billion years ago or whatever, it was still a contingent thing. It could have gone a different way. Um, so But your point, I might be missing an aspect of your question about recursion. Is there more you could fill in that I'm not responding to adequately there?
Oh, just that. No, I think that helps a lot actually. So it's like, but I mean, we could list some societies and say, there's a chain of societies here where, what did you say, that they shelter more and more complex forms of relating? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
Uh, yeah, I think that works for me. I think that works for me. It's like so that if we are inside many complex forms of relating, then it looks like we're inside a lawful universe where almost, the laws don't change. And if we are looking into many more finer resolutions of complex relating, then things end up looking simpler, but there's more of them. It's like, there's this electron over here and there's that electron over there. And shit, there's a whole shitload of electrons, but they're all the same, right?
yeah.
So the family sort of
Yeah.
splits or the family sort of unifies as you go in different directions. So um I think that does speak to the recursion that I was after. That's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we've all seen the Pixar movie Ants. I think it was a Pixar movie. And like that gives them each personalities. But when we're looking at the ant hill, one ant's as good as another ant, and we could
Yeah.
imagine a very large mind looking at human beings, and we might appear just like ants. And that's kind of what it is like with electrons, for us.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of,
One ant
yeah,
is one ant is seems pretty similar to another ant. They're all ants, but it matters that there's a lot of ants, and they're all in slightly different relation to one another, and that's how the colony does something that's more than just a lot of ant.
right.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, the Kaufmans are next.
Hey, Stu. Hey, Catherine.
Wait, wait.
Matt,
There we go.
uh, Kat, I think that Kat has made me audible. Matt, you're really quite wonderful, just amazing. Did you ever know, this is not beside the point, did you ever know Stephen Jay Gould?
I mean, I've read his work. No, I never met him, if that's what
So
you mean.
he and I are sort of the same age. When I used to listen to Stephen, I thought I could play tennis like that, but I can't. Okay. Listening to you was marvelous, and I want to thank you deeply. Another comment. I think we're going to probably agree that we are somehow moving beyond amazing Newton 340 years later. Matt, it's so wide open. Um, I'm deeply glad for your representation of what I'm trying to say. Uh, I will, if you will, end with one more thing. In the past few months, well, maybe a year or so, I have tried to marry the idea of catalytic closure and constraint closure. Do you know about this yet?
Hmm.
Read
Yeah.
your new book.
Okay, so go ahead, Matt.
Well, I've been spending time with your most recent book and in your, your earlier books too, so I'm familiar, but unpack your.
Yeah, why don't, give me a moment because it is the union of whatever you said, form and flow. So for those who may not quite know this, let me just tell you. Um, uh, Matteo Mosio and Mael Montiville came up with their wonderful idea of constraint closure. In truth, I had been stuck for 15 years. I wasn't smart enough to get what they got. Um, and I then took it in a slightly different direction, Matt, that may be really important. But I never would have gotten there without them. So they say that constraint closure is a set of constraints that mutually depend upon one another. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction that I think turns out to be fundamental. So here's the way into it. Now, what is work? Well, it's force acting through a distance. Then Atkins says, no, no, no. Work is the constrained release of energy into a few degrees of freedom. So I tried to understand that. That's a canon, which is a constraint and a boundary condition. The powder at the base of the cannon, the cannonball, and the boundary condition constraint constrains the release of energy. You don't get a spherical wave in the explosion. The explosion propagates down the remaining degree of freedom, namely the bore of the cannon, and does thermodynamic work on the ball. Okay, I got it. Uh, then what I thought about is, okay, I accept no constraints on the release of energy, no work. And being a medical doctor, not a physicist, where did the cannon come from? So I don't put it in its boundary conditions. I ask, so where did the cannon come? Well, it took work to make the cannon. Uh-oh. Newton needs boundary conditions, but he never tells us where they come from. And I got as far as realizing work could construct a constraint. Somebody constructed the canyon. And I got stuck. So in 2015 or 16, I saw a constraint closure. I said, that's fundamental. I'm going to change what Matteo and Mael mean. I will mean that constraint B depends upon constraint A if and only if A is a boundary condition constraint that constrains the release of energy into the few degrees of freedom that constructs B. Okay? So mine depend upon as a construct, not a depend, or it's stronger than that. So my favorite example is Gonan Ashkenazi has a 9-peptide autocatalytic set. Each peptide, he feeds in half peptides of the 9 from the outside, and each peptide, peptide 1, binds the 2 half fragments of peptide 2, orients them in 3 space, lowers the energy barrier to ligate them, and then thermodynamic work is done, and an ATP breaks down to ADP, and it constructs a second copy of peptide 2. 2 does for 3 and around the cycle, and 9 does for 1. So this system is both collectively autocatalytic and has constraint closure. That's what I mean by constraint closure. And I've now been living with this idea inside of it for about a year and a half. And I've tried, I think you may know this now, but for the rest of us, I've tried the idea that we can define life as the union of catalytic and constraint closure. It's both form and flow. The flow is the processes. And in a non-ergodic universe where we're present in the universe way above the level of about 500 Daltons, that now constitutes one fundamental sense of agency. And I knew all of that. About 2 weeks ago, I was trying to understand what form is. So I looked up Aristotle's form. I think this is a modern version of Aristotle's form from 2,400 years ago. I think, Matt, see what you think about it. I'm not an Aristotelian scholar. In that case, you know better than I, and many of you do. For Aristotle, the form of the oak is the essence of this specific oak tree. It's what makes the oak tree what it is. There's a sense of wholeness in the form that's not there in mechanism and parts hooked to one another. And I think that is precisely this marriage of catalytic and constraint closure is the form. We lost the form. The form was central to philosophy for 2,000 years, and we lost it with Newton and entailing laws, which are syntactic. Form is semantic. And I'm beginning to try to understand this as a biologist. Cells literally construct themselves. They're not constructed from the outside. Feynman cannot understand it and construct the dividing liver cell. And I'm beginning to get the image of something like the anatomy of construction. Cells inside of a dividing liver cell, there's all kinds of constrained release of energy that builds more constraints in all kinds of loops and cycles that we cannot see yet. It's easy to see in the case of Gunnar Ashkenazi said, which is some kind of anatomy of autopoiesis, the anatomy of internal construction. And we don't know this. So, two more points. The RNA world says only template replicating polynucleotides are a stable molecular form that allows heritability. So, the selfish gene and then beyond it. But an autocatalytic set of proteins, which exists, Gonan said, or RNA or DNA, or small molecule autocatalytic sets that exist, is a completely different stable form of heritability. And that means something like down over 4 billion years, the forms of organisms aren't just carried in the genes, it's carried in the ever evolving Aristotelian form. Aristotle's forms didn't evolve, but this form has evolved, from over 4 billion years. It's so mysterious. Somehow I'm confident that something like this is true. It's nowhere in medicine. Nowhere we talk about form. We don't have an understanding of how cells construct themselves. And I trained in medicine. And I'm in a biotech company. We don't have the idea yet, Matt. We can't see it yet. And I'm just stunned to stop. Anyway, it's marvelous listening to you. And I'm deeply grateful. And you too, for this whole series that we're getting to do. So that was it's the French intervention. I should like to make an intervention and then going on for an hour and a half. Matt, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Stu. I can't remember if it was reading one of your earlier books or where I picked up this idea that Newton can describe how the apple falls from the tree, but not how it got up there in the first
Yeah,
place, right? And
yeah,
the thing about Aristotle is, I mean, just a brilliant observer of the living world
yeah,
and of ontogenesis. He knew nothing of phylogenesis. He knew nothing of evolution. He knew the universe as a static series of concentric spheres out to God, and God is the final cause. But his account of formal cause is very, very dynamic. It's this
yeah,
movement from potential to actual,
yeah.
right? And with Darwin, we get evolution and we get variation, but Darwin assumes organization,
Yes,
organisms that want to survive, right? And
yeah, let me just throw in that. Yeah, Darwin gives us the filter
yeah,
of heritable variation and natural selection, and it's brilliant and it's right. But he doesn't ever tell us how we get that which is filtered.
right.
How did we get life? How do we get variation of form? And think about Mike Levin's morphologies. Somehow Mike's morphologies are Aristotelian forms that construct themselves. It's so mysterious.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the challenge is to bring Aristotle and Darwin together. And I think this
Yeah,
means again, this is why I'm bringing in the theological piece, which I often am a bit embarrassed about that, um, because it can be upsetting to scientists when you bring that in. But I think the imaginative background of mechanistic science is so theological, but we forget that.
Yeah.
And so to really break out of the mechanistic paradigm means rethinking these theological assumptions. And Aristotle is not a mechanistic thinker, um, but he has this view of the divine as the final cause that's just, thought thinking itself beyond the eighth sphere. And that becomes the paradigm that all other forms of organization are trying to imitate in a way. And, Whitehead's doing something analogous to that, but he's evolutionizing it. And so, you know, that that divine thought thinking itself that's for Aristotle totally unaffected by what happens in the universe. The universe is just uh, copying that, imitating that. But the divine doesn't care, can't care what's happening in the world. And evolution requires us thinking of it differently, that there is no perfectly closed thought thinking itself at the peak of
Yeah.
everything, right? Somehow we could still talk about the divine, but it's got to be an imminent lure,
Yes.
right? And that doesn't just change how we think about science, but there's deep existential shifts in our sense of what it is to be a human being and what we can hope for, and so on, that I think has major emotional consequences. And so there are reasons that some scientists who are really holding tight to the mechanistic paradigm would resist it. And then there's reasons that religious people would resist it because it's disturbing to think of God as not all powerful and large and in charge. And, you know, um, and so this is a difficult needle to thread, but I think it's our task.
Nice. Great. Sai, did you have a question yet? I think you might be still muted. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for that talk. It was incredibly powerful and intense, and covered a lot of ground, most of which was outside of my realm of understanding. However, I do want to follow up on the things that Stu just said and a lot of the things that he were also implicit in what he said. And sort of also follow up what Richard asked and your answers to him, and that relates to this historicity of physics. Um, when we talk about agency in biology, we talk about the ability of all organisms down to bacteria to do things, and they act not only with whatever this agency is, but they act with the ability to be aware of their environment, some sort of cognition. And you could even add teleology in there because they act for a reason, they act for a purpose. Sometimes that purpose is simply to stay alive or to reproduce or whatever. But that characteristic of living organisms, all living organisms have this. I don't see that, and this goes along with what Richard was asking. I don't see that happening in the physical universe, at least at the current time. Now, your answer to him was very interesting. You basically said, well, it happened early on when, you know, decisions were made by whatever, however, as to how electrons will behave and not behave, but that's interesting, and I think that could really be true. But then I don't you think we perhaps need a different word other than the words we use for life? Because we're talking about a past historical thing which is no longer applicable. I mean, today rocks don't decide to fall down hills, and volcanoes don't think, gee, I think I'd like to, I'd like to blow up. There, we don't see agency in the non-biological world, and that may be simply what you said is it's a question of perspective. We don't have that perspective. But if that's the case, I feel it would be useful to find a different word for that compared to what we see in life. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. The Whitehead says metaphysics, like all sciences, has its instruments that it experiments on, and in the case of metaphysics, we don't have telescopes, microscopes. We experiment on the instrument of language itself, and so we're constantly searching for novel phraseology to capture really general ideas. And Whitehead reaches for words like feeling and generalizes it so that it applies, to pulses of light just as much as it applies to, a bacterium swimming up a glucose gradient because it tastes something yummy, you know. Whether or not that's um, a helpful way of speaking or not remains, to be seen, but we have to make choices about what type of words we use. And what Whitehead does distinguish biological life from what's going on in the chemical world and the physical world, um, in the sense that cellular life, in his terms, seems to be able to originate novelty in terms of its behaviors and decisions that isn't found in its lineage, right? In the sense that, an electron is going to, or photon is going to carry the same vibratory frequency, forever, until it's interfered with or interacts with something. Um, a cell can make real breaks with its causal past and do something new. Um, if you're around a dog and you know um, clap your hands really loud, it depends on the dog how it's going to react. It's not just a, you know, simple mechanism of cause and effect that it will behave in the same way every time. And so agency intensifies as you go up the scale in nature, but Whitehead would just say there's no sharp line. There's no ontological gap between physics and chemistry and the first cell that needs to be explained. There's some kind, he calls it prehension or feeling or some basal form of the agency that's present all the way down. And now I know Mike Levin says something similar about agency being a continuum or a spectrum in nature. And I would want to make some distinctions about, I'm not as ready to give up the machine organism distinction as he is. Because I think even though I think agency shades down all the way, I think machines are they're assembled in a different way. And maybe if he means machine in a way that's, assembled at the nanoscale and, more like organisms, then okay, that's a different question. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Nice. That was great. Mary?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this discussion, Matt.
Oh, you got muted again somehow.
Oh, how
Oh,
did that? Okay.
I think we share a lot of kind of interaction with the integral world as well. So I've been following your work for a while, and it's great to be able to talk to you. I have a question about the nature of the of holons, the turtles all the way down. Um, and what you describe as the societies and whether or not you've had any thoughts about what the invariance might be of these societies and whether or not you think they are continuous, recursive or rhyming, if you will, maybe from the ingression from the Platonic space all the way down to, say, perhaps Sleptevic's, I said his name incorrectly, biocivilizations and maybe endosymbiont theory. It seems to me like there may be some habits that are kind of repeated in a rhyming or fractal or um, fashion. And I'll mute for your answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to see the self-similarity. at different scales in cosmic evolution of how, in Whitehead's term, societies take form. So, a galaxy is a society of stars, right? And a star is a society of atoms. Um, and they each have their lifespans. And apparently, galaxies can die in the sense that the spiral form that allows new stars to emerge breaks down for different reasons. And stars, they have their life cycle, right? And the astronomer Eric Chason describes uh, multiple generations of stars in terms of a metric he calls energy rate density, and suggests that we can understand stars as evolving in a sense. Um, and becoming more complex as heavier elements get produced and more complex stars and so on. And so, yeah, I think that uh, there is a self-similarity at different scales in nature, and evolution at all scales in nature. Um, Evolution at the biological level is even, I mean, there are major evolutionary transitions that make the amount of novelty that can be produced increase rapidly. Um, and so it's not like we just want to, say it's all the same across scales. Like there are major transitions which occur, but I think there is a deeper self-similarity at work here, um, and it's not just a coincidence. It's a deep structure, deep organizing principle.
Would you call them holons starting at the highest level, these societies? Of where we're
Um,
not we're talking about the pre-physical or the sort of substrate from which prior to what we would understand or outside of.
I like, it's Arthur Koestler's term originally, the holon, which is something that's both whole and part. Um, a cell as a whole, but it's also a part of a multicellular organism and so on. And that kind of nesting relationship is what I was trying to describe earlier with the societies enveloping one another and providing backgrounds of order within which more complex order can be sustained. I mean, there are all these things that the universe needs to keep doing for us as biological organisms to stay alive, far beyond just the chemistry in our skin. You know, if the laws of electromagnetism were to, or the I should say, the deeply canalized habits of electromagnetism were to change,
Yeah.
we'd immediately break down. And other fundamental constants they're constant enough that um, we stay alive. Um, and all of that needs to be assumed as pretty stable in order for all the dynamic stuff involved in our metabolism to keep doing its thing. And so, yeah, I mean, holon is a fine word. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting distinctions we could make about different kinds of societies. Some societies in Whitehead's sense are living, and he would talk about um, a dominant monad or percipient event that, in a
Mhm.
vertebrate organism, all of the environment gets filtered through our senses and our nervous system, and that information gets channeled into a presiding occasion, is another phrase he uses for it. And,
Right.
plants are a little bit more democratic in their organization, to use a political metaphor, than animals, which are more monarchical in their organization. This is Whitehead's metaphor. And so they're like different kinds of societies, and they're not all the same, but there are, again, at different scales, patterns that repeat. Yeah.
I'm just curious about what you think might be the recurring patterns. I've outlined what I think are the invariants of a holon. Perhaps I could send it to you and you could tell me how far you think it might go in either direction or if I just missed something obvious.
Sure. Yeah. Please,
Thank
please
you.
do share.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mary. Rupert?
Thanks very much, Matt, for your talk. It was really stimulating and lots of things I loved about it. I was interested when you got to the idea of the eternal objects being able to be modified or changed through what actually happens. This is the emphasis on creativity. I'm more influenced by Bergson than Whitehead, or at least I read Bergson first. And Bergson has an enormously strong influence on emphasis on creativity, as in his book Creative Evolution. So I like that. And I've been thinking recently about Michael Levin's idea of how what he calls four Platonic forms. He now has this idea they can evolve, they can be modified depending on what happens. And this, of course, is very similar to what I've called for years morphic resonance, the idea that there are formal causes throughout the whole of nature through what I call morphic fields, and that these are influenced by what's happened in the past. My model is that there's a direct influence from the past to the present, giving a kind of collective memory in each kind of thing. His model is that the form comes from outside space and time, but comes into space and time. Then what happens affects the form outside space and time. When it comes in again, it's different. It gives rise to essentially the same predictions. So I think of mine as a kind of evolutionary Aristotelianism, and I loved what you said about Darwin and Aristotle. And whereas his strikes me a kind of evolutionary Platonism, but the difference may not be very obvious when it comes to actual empirical tests. And in terms of empirical tests, when you talk in terms of evolutionary physics or historicizing physics, I've actually been trying to test this, and I wonder what you think of the possibility of tests. Because although electrons have been doing the same thing for an awfully long time and they're in deep grooves of habit, there are things in the physical world which are new, that are truly creative. And the realm I've concentrated on is synthetic chemistry. Chemists are making new compounds. They make thousands of new organic chemicals every year. And moreover, they crystallize them. And that means there's thousands of new crystal forms coming into being every year that haven't existed before. And according to evolutionary Platonism or morphic resonance, then you'd expect them to form more easily the more often they've happened, the habits to grow up. And actually, it's well known that new compounds become easier to crystallize as time goes on. And one of the tests I've been looking at recently is changes in melting points. If compounds become more stable, more habitual, it should be harder to disrupt them. And the way you disrupt a chemical is by heating it up and it reaches a melting point. So I predicted that melting points of new compounds should go up. And actually, in a survey of hundreds of organic chemicals, it turns out that practically all of them do go up. And by between 2 or 3 degrees and 40 or 50 degrees. I mean, we're not talking fractions of a degree. So I think that actually this historicizing of physics is testable. I think there's already evidence that suggests a kind of memory in the physical world, or at least the chemical world. I think one could do experiments on Bose-Einstein condensates, for example, which you can make a new Bose-Einstein condensate at 0.1 or 0.01 of a degree above absolute zero. And this would probably never have existed in the whole history of the universe because the background temperature is 2.7 degrees Kelvin. If you make a new Bose-Einstein condensate in the lab, and then you keep doing the same kind of experiment, you might be able to observe either evolutionary Platonism or morphic resonance, depending on your choice of phrases, by seeing the rate speeding up. So I think that this is actually eminently testable. And the theoretical physicist Lee Smolin has also suggested the kind of evolution of laws of nature. He thinks it would only happen at the quantum level, but if Smolin's right, then it should happen in Bose-Einstein condensates, even if it doesn't happen in chemical crystals or rates of crystallization or melting points. So I wondered how much you see this. I see it as an empirical question. I wonder how much you see it as an empirical question too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard about your desire. Obviously, I know about your desire to test some of these things, but this melting point uh, data is very interesting. And as a speculative philosopher, I'm always very happy when an experimentalist says that an idea that I'm proposing can be tested. I mean, I think that's great. I think the issue with this idea of, fixed laws and constants is less an empirical matter because, it's pretty well established that when we try to go out and measure these things, like the speed of light, you've written about that. It's that the speed of light is a constant is a postulate. When we try to measure it, it's never exactly, uh, the right speed. And so it's not an empirical issue so much as a theoretical one. We create these models where the laws have to be fixed, and then we filter the observations through the laws and through the models, right? And so the effective theorization of physics is a very powerful method, but again, it's mistaking the model for the reality when the empirical reality is, as you're suggesting, that no, these things do change and change in very interesting ways that suggests an interplay between the actual and the potential, where there's like a non-local learning process occurring here. And distance and physical space is not any it doesn't put a limit on formal causality. It puts a limit on efficient causality, but not formal causality.
Mm.
That's huge. We're missing a lot if we don't take that into consideration.
Thanks. That's a really interesting point, that there's no limit on formal causality through space. That's terribly important, I think. Yeah, well, I'll think about that.
Thanks, Rupert.
Awesome. Thank you. Henry?
Are you here? Okay,
We
great.
got
Really enjoy your talk. So when you discuss like the form and the flow, the relationship, actually biological, actually quite interesting. Just as Dr. Kaufman said, there's an interdependent relationship, but there's also co-evolving relationship. So now for the evolution, now we're thinking there are three key components always involved. One is information themselves. And the second is the carrier, for example, different species. And the third is the ecosystem. Three of them is simultaneously evolved during the evolution process. So each of them cannot be independent. But the relationship actually is transformed with each other is quite fascinating. For example, the information may be most fundamental. They change the form, right? They use energy, they change the form. And the form actually provides the carrier for information themselves. So information can pass by and become new information form, right? At the same time, ecosystem defines the boundary of the selection. So previously, people talking about evolution, they always separated each of them. But now we realize that they are inseparable. So for example, under crisis of the environment, the condition is changing, and the information feedback to the genome just goes through genome chaos. So they just randomly create new information and find the right carrier, that's a new species, and then the information be preserved much on in the universe. But interestingly enough, is Darwin never discussed this idea about the evolution is directional. So what is the direction? Is the information complexity increase this direction, right? So every time under stress, so the form and the flow relationship become conflict. So the information always change themselves by biology, organisms themselves. So that actually is quite interesting part. The congregation become more and more complex is because the information complexity is increased, right? So with this way, we actually thinking many things we can address. Even Mary just talking about what's the recurrent pattern. We actually looking back for the history of the evolution. They always have two-phased evolution. Macroevolution first to create a new system. Microevolution follow to duplicate the system. So from the beginning to the end to the society, every time is the same thing. You change the new information, find the new suitable carrier and different societal form. And then evolution is all about conservation, right? So the most 99% of evolution is about conservation, about this form and the flow relationship. Is this thinking make sense from your point of view? Because now we actually realize that the biological system different from the physical system is only biological system can self-create the information, right? So that's actually, and all the genetics, all the everything is constrained. So I actually really like Alicia's constraint concept as everything. So now we know that Darwin missed the point that he missed the constraint. The constraint is the most important in evolution. And the creativity only happen when the ecosystem have the problem. So the relationship between the form and the flow have conflict. That is the innovation occur because otherwise they don't have the chance, right? So that's the idea. So from your point of view, I hope you can share some light, from philosophical thinking, whether or not we're on the right way of thinking the evolution and thinking how to incorporate with the cognition. Because we're thinking then gradually the cognition could become so complicated. The human, we can choose the environment with, we can choose some places rather than Earth to live in for themselves. It's completely become the spectrum of the deterministic. But initially, biological only have very little cognition, and this process is reflect on the information complexity. So how do you like this, the framework?
Yeah, I think that all sounds very much congruent with what I'm suggesting, and we need to understand evolution as a process that's like what's evolving? Well, it's the whole organism environment nexus that's evolving. And there's this question of information as what makes life distinct, I think is what you were saying.
Yes, because they can
Life creates its own information.
self creation. So give you one example. So when we try to kill the cancer cell, right? The instantly all the chromosome reshuffling. Each configuration is a new set of system information. So they do not need some very strange power to guide them. So biological system knows, but they only know little. They only know the increased probability in general. They don't know the specificity. And then the natural selection actually favor the specificity. So that's actually the story about how the information each time become more complex. So they only know we need the mechanism to get more different variable.
Yeah.
So that's a biological sense. Yeah.
In Whitehead's book, The Function of Reason, he talks about the Darwinian account of evolution in terms of the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, Spencer's term, and says that if survival was really the only factor here, we would have no explanation, and this is to your point about the kind of directionality here. We'd have no explanation why organisms that are comparatively deficient in survival power, more complex organisms that are more fragile, would ever evolve. And so Whitehead thinks there must be, I mean, this is why the question of agency is so important, that organisms are able to respond creatively to environmental changes in ways that don't seem to be accounted for just by the inheritance from their lineage. I mean, this is Mike Levin. Another thing Mike Levin is discovering, that there's creativity in living cells that seems truly not just spontaneous in the sense of random. It's intelligent. It's goal seeking.
Yes. So
Right.
what's the sentence? So if you're looking for the history, so all the different species be replaced. What's left is the information become more complex. So that's the only fact left. The anything else carrier, they all be replaced. So that is the fact. We have to think about that. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions about information, but that would be a whole nother 2 hours for us to get into what's meant. by information here, because I mean, the idea of information being stored in a genome, for example, always struck me as it's like a new form of preformationism, and that really information is always, it's, as Bateson would say, it's a difference that makes a difference. And I would say it's a difference that makes a difference to somebody, to some organism. And if there's any information in biological processes, which clearly, it's meaningful to talk about that. It's not stored in a particular molecule. It's as much stored in the whole, intracellular matrix as it is in the environment and the whole series of historical environments that, that a lineage has lived through.
So that we need to change right now. We can discuss more. I said something. That way, so everything inherited is incorrect. So right now, they have actually the mechanism to preserve the information. So that's that. So that we need to identify this, which is a karyotype coding. But anyway, we can discuss that later on. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
Thanks,
I'd like to understand that point better. Yeah.
Thank you, Henry. Alicia?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Matt. I'm really appreciative of your exegesis of Whitehead because I'm trained in philosophy and I never understood Whitehead. The neologisms just killed me. And I was particularly struck by your emphasis on how he allows for, say, a historicization of physics, that would be possible. And I would say historicizing, localizing physics is straight down my alley. I like that a lot. It's the going up side that concerns me a bit more because I think at this point language matters. I am upset by the idea of the Neoplatonism, either from Levin or from Chalmers or from a lot of these folks, in part because, and that's why I tend to, if I were to go, I'd go more with your Aristotelian, but I have a problem with that too. For Plato, as we know, forms were eternal, unchanging, and fixed and rigid. And therefore, the question was, how do they get into matter? But that was the same problem that Aristotle faced. If there are two books that I really rely on, and that is Depew and Weber's book called Darwinism Evolving, and also Lennox and Gill about Aristotle saying, look, the relationship between formal and efficient and final cause in Aristotle was never made particularly clear. So that's one of the reasons I think language is important. I'm not crazy about the idea of Aristotelian evolution because for Aristotle, he did believe in forms just as much as Plato did. He just didn't believe that there was a separate realm where they could exist independently. The form always exists for Aristotle as embodied, embedded in a particular entity. So for Aristotle, there is no evolution. There is only what we would call development or specification, which you kind of suggest that is the role of the propositions, that they would specify the eternal objects. But that would suggest to me that there is no absolute qualitative novelty possible. It's just a question of specification and more fifth decimal point of the existing form, if you will, kind of thing. Why? And I was struck at the beginning that you said, well, it's a price too high to pay well, it seems to me almost a price lower to pay to say, look, the cosmos is creative. It throws off emergent properties that are unpredictable because what they basically do, and I'd say something different from what Stuart said. I wouldn't say that it's a different organ. I'd say the topology changes altogether. And so it's a whole new, it is creative. And so then just dispense with the whole notion of eternal objects, dispense with the whole notion of all of that and just say, look, there is a mechanism, and I'm perfectly happy saying it's enabling constraints, it's constitutive constraints, it's regulatory constraints, it's constraints all the way down and all the way up. And in each case, you get emergent properties that are qualitatively different from the ones before. So even though, yes, a tornado is a dissipative structure that is also, yeah, but it doesn't have properties that living things do, and human beings have properties that the lower animal and plant forms do not. And so why do you really think it's a price too high to pay to say, let's just forget the whole notion of eternal? It's almost sounds to me like it's epicyclic contortions trying to get the Copernican, the Ptolemaic theory to continue by keeping the notion of God, the notion of eternal object. If you chuck all of that and just say, there is a tendency in the universe to increasing coherence and autocatalytic closure, and then constraint closure on top of autocatalytic closure gives you something else, and so on. Why isn't that an option?
Yeah, Alicia, there's a very good question. I'm tempted to say, there are cat people and there are dog people. There are Platonists and there are Aristotelians. There are.
My point is they're both the same insofar they both believe that eternal forms are eternal, unchanging, and fixed. So one says, yeah, but they get specified differently in nature, in organic forms. Plato says, oh, they're cheap copies, they're derivative. You shouldn't even pay attention to them.
So when we think about, I'll give different examples of the same thing, I think, happening at different scales. A mathematician who's engaged in the creative effort, to trace out a new pattern that's never been conceived before, or an organism that's experienced a mutation and a new function has been discovered as a result of that. There seems to be, in these cases of a creative advance into novelty, that space of possibilities that's being explored isn't just the possibilities aren't just arbitrarily related, right? There's a structure there.
Correct.
We could say that structure is established just by adjacency to actuality, and it sort of isn't there already definite before an actual organism, a living mathematician or a cell sort of dips into it.
No, but why does it have to be an outside entity like a scientist or like this? Why can't the constraint dynamics, the recursive aspect, the constraint closure aspect, all of that is the creative, and what it's creating is new potential, real new possibility. It doesn't need an efficient cause that's outside, or that something outside that produces the boundary conditions within kids, which is what Polanyi tried to do. Polanyi was perfectly happy with self-organization until you got to boundary conditions. Then he wanted to make sure somebody outside or something or some entity or some deity produce those boundary conditions. Why not say that that's the key thing about Stewart's autocatalysis? They create their own boundary conditions, which is what in fact they're doing.
Right. Yeah, well, I accept that part. I think I'm trying to walk a line here that's between where I hear Mike Levin going, where he is giving basically efficient causal power to the forms. The agency is coming from the forms, in Mike's view.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be efficient causality.
It should be formal.
Yeah, but it's formal, not that pre-existed in any way, shape, or form. It is true novelty. Right. That's what I would like to say. Why not? It seems to be simpler. Occam's razor beats postulating eternal objects and all the rest of it.
I think both for the in terms of there's an axiological side to it and just a logical side to it, which is that this realm of possibility seems ordered.
Yes.
And that we in some way ingress, as organisms, ingress that order.
Yeah, I think that second part is questionable. It is. New order is qualitative novelty, and it is new. And it does, I think you're absolutely right. It brings in axiology in with it, because a function can either be better, more efficient, more parsimonious. So you do have valence, qualitative value that comes in with every new creation, but it's endogenous. That's why that's where I thought you were going with the panentheism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a if you get a chance to read the longer
Yeah,
essay that I prepared for this, I'm trying to lay out Whitehead's distinction between definiteness and determinateness. And I know you don't like his neologisms and the seeming scholastic, machinations of his metaphysics, but I think in questions like this, it's like I'm trying to have it both ways. Like I really don't want to hypostatize a separate realm,
correct.
of
I like that. Yeah,
already determined forms that we're just trying to copy,
correct,
right?
correct.
But there's a subtler point here that keeps me thinking with Whitehead and his account of an intensive ordering of the what he calls eternal objects and the grading of their relevance um, for each occasion of experience in the life history of an organism that, you know, for some reason I'm not able to let go of, because then I feel like I lose the ability to understand where the structuring of possibilities uh,
The constraint
comes
dynamics.
from.
Yeah, I would think. But
Yeah.
no, I
You're
think
pushing on exactly the right place.
no,
I mean,
I think, for example, that any new creation has to, because it is creating new possibilities, is almost by definition multiply realizable, if not multiple. And then that opens up the actual realization further down. But whatever is brand spanking new has got to be a multiply realizable concept. For what I don't want to use the word form, because then we're buying into the fixity, the rigidness, the unchangingness, the universality of it. And if you really believe that that physics is going to go down to historical, then that's got to be all the way up and down, I think. I think. Anyway, I want to read your more detailed.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's such a subtle. This is a very subtle issue, and I'm with you in what you're resisting, and I'm trying to carve out
No, I'm very
a third
interested
way.
because I'm it is certainly part of the tradition, and I'd like to see if what aspect of that can still fit in to this new way of looking at the universe. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
No, it was
Yeah.
very good. I understood a lot about Whitehead that I didn't before. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for
Thanks, Steve.
serving that. Okay, Andrea, you still with us? Her hand is up. Andrea, you there? Have a question? Comment? Going once? Oh, okay, we'll move on to Kate Kaufman, and if Andrea comes back, we'll come back.
Thanks. First of all, Matt, for that absolutely exquisite love letter to Stu. Um, you are a soul son, clearly, and there are many of us that want to continue building upon that foundation. So bless you, my son. And Alicia, I think that there really is a beautiful space where we can have our cake and eat it too, about flexibility and eternal form. Mike Levin says that if you ask why long enough, you end up in the math department. I've been hanging out there and the math department and thinking about the quantum physics. And I think that we have a lot of really good open territory there to mine. But what Stu and I were talking about form and function and this idea of eternal form, what if the historicity of everything that's ever happened builds a record, an ongoing record of that would sort of give us an eternal nature. But I have to I think that that's part of what we need to add to the story in terms of the idea of what that would support theological ideas like reincarnation and connections between people across lives, like similar to braided trajectories in Hilbert space, things like this. So you have historicity, context, all those things are up for grabs in terms of honoring the internality and agency that living systems have. So what I want to say is that you the way to have the constraints add three different new closures I've been working on. Well, first of all, clarifying identity closure, how the information works top down, bottom up. You're really an expert in that, Alicia. Bless you. But that enhancing on Pati's idea of semantic closure is going to put that axiology back in. But it all turns on what I'm calling identity closure, which is how that boundary gets constructed. And here in the math department, we're looking at self-referential systems, which is, of course, Gödelian openness in mathematics. So I think that there's really a beautiful space in there where we can talk about iterative self-reference distinctioning that are being made constantly through this iterative process that is part of the transition and translation between the possible and the actual. And that's something that the agent is doing fresh in every moment through their own historicity, contextuality, and perspective, but it is anchored to axiology through the structure of identity and the fact that any geometric structure is a resonance cavity, as well as you can anchor the balancing in gauge symmetry, the rightness, if you will, the yes, no, this form is right for me or that form is wrong for me, that you can anchor that in the mathematical structure and in gauge theory. So I'm really excited to go forward with all of this too, Matt. I am thrilled that fine young mind with you with such a unique mastery with language. You are incredible that way. I've never seen anyone as close to Stu as you are in terms of your verbal fluidity. So thank you so much. But Alicia, I think that there's a lot of great hope by adding identity closure and enhancing semantic closure to clarify what we mean by information closure. And then we're going to have our cake and eat it too. And we're going to have a whole new way of thinking about the internal domain and our subjective access into it, and particularly the role of emotion. And by the way, evolution is a great story, but we need to go back to Darwin, who wrote about emotion in man and animals. He had that from the beginning, but it was sort of laundered out and dropped over time with this really big push to stay away from anything religious. But we're not there anymore. We've come full circle back to what we mean by soul, what we mean by spirit. I mean, spirit is really this process, this flux, this flow, and any kind of form that may be eternal, that is constantly within our own ability to reconfigure is is in the story as well. So uh, these are good times. I think there's room for optimism.
Hmm.
So my question for you, Matt, how deep are you going into the math and the physics of this? Because everything you're saying, I think, is there's territory to mine there.
Well, I appreciate your compliments about my verbal facility. My math is not it's not there. And so I can't really claim to be making any advances on the mathematical side of this, but I'm always looking for colleagues to collaborate with who are doing that. Um, it's funny that, I would get into a philosopher like Whitehead, whose method is so mathematical.
Mhm.
Um, and so all of his concepts are informed by his work on Principia with Russell and how that failed. And I think trying to ground arithmetic in the logic of sets ended up not working. They ran into all these paradoxes, and Gödel came decades later, but Whitehead was liberated by that to do speculative philosophy in a new kind of way. And both was guided by the example of mathematics, but also recognized how mathematics can mislead philosophers. Like, Spinoza, brilliant as he is, thinking that you can geometrically prove a particular speculative philosophical view, Whitehead would say philosophy is not about proof. It's the search for premises, actually, right?
Indeed.
Aristotle knew that too. Uh, and Peirce has his abductive form of reasoning, which is very relevant here too. But yeah, no, I'm not making any advances on this mathematically, unfortunately.
Well, let me just finish with I'm very fortunate to be privy to the mind of Lou Kaufman, who is one of the leading theorists on topology and knot theory. And he's helping me fill in all of the gaps that a bad education left. And
Mm.
so I'm happy to pass along. There's a lot of really beautiful stuff about self-reference and the laws of form with Spencer Brown, where you have this
Right.
whole way of thinking. So we'll talk. We'll talk later. But let me do as much
Great.
heavy lifting as I can, and then I'll pass it along to you.
That sounds great. Division of labor.
Exactly.
Awesome. Awesome, guys. Thank you guys so much. This was such a great meeting. Before I close, I want to read. Wayne Lewis had a question that was burning him up, and then he had to leave. It's not actually a question, it's a comment. So I'm going to read it. He says, Alicia, have you by any chance read Tim Eastman, Untying the Gordian Knot? It unpacks a great deal. The big leap is allowing yourself to fit home the pure potentia with internal relations, which is what Whitehead meant by forms, are an aspect of reality just as actuality does. Many problems evaporate. What Whitehead meant by eternal was different from how people interpret Plato. Eternal for Whitehead means that potentia arise and increase because of historical unchangeable fact as time evolves.
Mm.
So I think that was just a comment, but he wanted to be
Thank
sure
you.
that we heard it. Yeah,
Thank you. I look into Eastman. Thank you.
yeah. Awesome. In any case, guys, we're at time, so I'm gonna bring it to a close. But thanks so much, Matt, and I just really want to extend an invitation for you to come back, and join future meetings as a member and participant because we really appreciate your work and it's given us a lot of resonance with many of the thinkers in this group and I just really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Charlie. Yeah, it was a joy to be here. Enjoyed all the questions and challenges. Definitely more to think through. So it's very generative for me. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, and we'll be coming back to some of this material later in the summer. Stu Kaufman's got a session in August, and before that, we've got another session with Vadim Bachman at Northwestern about the computational properties of the genome. So
Great.
it's exciting stuff to come. So join us again. Thank you guys so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.